in May this year, we published two reports presenting a revised calculation of a minimum London weighting. And I'm just going to talk through what we did and why we did it. So some context, the calculation itself, so the numbers, and then some important considerations or questions as we move forward. I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail on the calculation. That's all set out in the technical report, and probably was easier to digest written down rather than me trying to explain all of the numbers. But happy to obviously answer any questions about that. Good start. So, why is this an important thing to be doing? As Rebecca mentioned, obviously over the past few months, we've seen significant increases in the cost of living, and that is kind of exerting pressures on people's living standards, possibly greater pressures than we've seen, certainly for a long time, maybe not ever, but for a long time. And so an understanding of what a decent standard of living is and what a decent standard of living costs in that context is, as important as ever. So all of the work that we've done on the minimum London weighting is based on ongoing work that we do in London, funded by Trust for London, researching something called the minimum income standard. Why is that a useful thing to do? So we know, and we knew before we started the research in 2015, that households in London tend to have higher costs, particularly in relation to those big three costs: housing, childcare, and public transport. But there hadn't been any kind of systematic assessment of the difference or what was needed by lots of households in order to cover those additional costs in London. So since 2015, when we first did our minimum income standard work in London, we've been looking at and working with groups of households, groups of individuals, looking at what different households need for that minimum standard of living. All of that work is on the Trust for London website, so I won't go into great detail about that this morning. But what that work does is, as I said, works with groups of members of the public to establish what the public think everyone needs to have in order to have a minimum socially acceptable standard of living in the UK today. And that's not just about the obvious things, so food, clothes, and shelter. It's about being able to take part in the world around you. So being able to participate in the city in which you live. And I think that's fundamentally important when we're thinking about the minimum London weighting, when we're thinking more generally about what we can do to increase incomes and reduce costs, both in London and outside of London. What that work has shown and consistently shown is that the cost of a decent standard of living in London is substantially higher than the rest of urban UK. So if you're a single working age adult living on your own in London, what you need on a weekly basis to have that decent standard of living is 58% higher in inner London and 33% higher in outer London. So significantly more to have that decent standard of living. For a household with children, so a couple with children, need around a quarter more than in other places in the UK for that same standard of living. We also know that lots of people in London are living below that standard. So the regular work that we do enables us to look at who is living below that minimum income standard. And the last time we looked at this, 41% of people living in London were in households who had an income below that minimum living standard. And that compares to 29% for the UK, for the whole of the UK. And that means that, 4 in 10 people don't have what they need for that living standard. As Rebecca's mentioned, as I have mentioned, there are growing pressures on household incomes, on household finances over recent months. And all of that is, on top of the situation we find ourselves in already, with lots of people not having what they need. Add that all up, it doesn't quite come to this big question, but it's an important question to ask. Is it reasonable to expect workers in London to live on the same incomes as workers elsewhere? Should there be a recognition by employers who employ people in different cities, different parts of the UK, that costs in London are higher, and that cost of a minimum standard of living is higher? So a kind of recognition of different costs for households in London. There are big questions more generally around incomes and costs, as Rebecca mentioned, the London living wage, but also questions about what can be done to reduce the cost of childcare, reduce the cost of housing, which seems to be something that there's been lots of talk about for a long time, but not necessarily anything that has fundamentally changed the housing costs that lots of people face. So this is part of that conversation, I think, and it's important to put it in that context. In and of itself, it's not the answer, just as in and of itself, the London living wage is not the answer to all of these challenges that households and individuals face. But what is important, I think, to emphasize here is that having a minimum London weighting based on and rooted in that kind of publicly defined minimum living standard can provide a useful baseline for employers who want to make sure that their workers are being paid fairly, that their workers are that shortfall between what people need and what people have is to some extent being addressed within London. I realise there are lots and lots of big questions there, and I've skated over lots of them very quickly, but I think that context is really, really important. So what did we actually do? How do we arrive at the figure that's been talked about and I'll talk about in a minute? So all of this work is based on looking at the additional weekly cost of that minimum standard of living in the capital compared to other urban parts of the UK. I should say that there are a range of different London allowances currently being paid. There doesn't seem to be any kind of systematic collection of or account of the different sorts of ones that are being paid. But some employers are paying a fixed amount, some employers are kind of paying a percentage uplift, but there's a wide variation, and it's not clear where these numbers have necessarily come from. So all of our work, again, is setting out to provide something that's rooted in kind of research and evidence. So we're looking at the difference between or the additional weekly cost that you need to have that standard of living in London compared to other urban areas of the UK. And the calculation itself, it reflects the different and additional costs that are identified in our ongoing research, as well as assumptions about rent and transport and childcare, which have been informed by the work that we do in London. In terms of the different and additional costs identified in our ongoing research, some of these differences relate to different patterns of social participation. So we're asking groups in London when we do this research what everyone should be able to have for that minimum standard of living. What should they be able to do? And one of the differences that groups have identified is the different cost of activities, different cost of social activities in the capital. And and that's for adults as well as for children. The core of what you need for that minimum standard of living is very similar or the same in London and other urban areas in the UK. But there are some of those costs associated with social participation in particular that are higher. So we build them in, but also some assumptions about rent. And I won't go through all of them. They're all set out in the report. I won't go through them in detail, but we're looking at what difference it makes living in the same kind of housing, for instance, in London. And that is the biggest source of difference. So the biggest contribution to those different, to those additional weekly costs is rent. We're looking at the different cost of, again, similar sorts of transport in London. So often in groups, when we're having these conversations, groups emphasize, the good transport links. I know it doesn't apply across everywhere in London, and there are areas where they are not so great. But in general, it's reasonably regarded, certainly compared to kind of buses in other parts of the UK. Childcare costs are higher in London. So we're bringing all of those things together and looking at what difference that makes to what people need on a weekly basis, and what difference that would make to what people would need to earn, and what contribution a minimum London weighting could make to that. So to answer that question, what extra do households need to earn in order to cover that additional cost, in order to have that minimum standard of living in London? I always hate it when people show tables on presentations. So I'm doing the thing that I don't like anyone doing, because I'm bombarding you with lots of numbers that need lots of explanation. But I wanted to kind of show you it. And if you haven't read the report already or had a look, then it is set out and discussed in far greater detail there. So this is for inner London. And in this calculation, we focused on 5 different household types. I recognise, and I think we recognise, that there are certainly refinements that could be made to the calculation and improvements, incorporating, for instance, new evidence on the distribution or composition of distribution of household types across London using the census 2021 rather than the census 2011, building in lone parent households into the calculation. There's also some big questions about rent that in any kind of future calculation, I think, would also be worth looking at in more detail. So this sets out the figure for 2021 for inner London, and you can see, I guess the most important number is the one at the bottom in bold. That the average that we end up with is £9,600. So what that's saying is that in terms of an annual minimum London weighting, in inner London, that would need to be that amount, and that would help low to middle income earners be able to meet be more likely to meet that standard of living, that minimum standard of living. I'm aware I'm approaching the quarter of an hour mark. This is the same one for outer London. Again, a whole load of numbers, but that one at the bottom is the important one. So 6,549 in outer London. I think it's worth noting that these are based on 2021 prices. An awful lot has happened since then. We are publishing our main minimum income standard work for the UK in September. And just to give you a sneak preview, things have gone up quite a lot. That's not a sneak preview and probably won't come as any great surprise, but the cost of a minimum has increased more rapidly this year than ever before. And the same will be true when we publish Ms. London work later in this year. That is undoubtedly going to be the case. And building that into the calculation would increase that London weighting by a reasonably significant amount. So who should benefit? The argument in the report is that the outer London weighting kind of serves as a good baseline. It's the amount that would allow workers to access employment anywhere in the capital, because it builds in the cost of a monthly travel card, zones 1 to 6. And a minimum London weighting, having that as a baseline, that would begin to help cover the essential costs that lots of households face from living in London. Lots of workers are facing those additional costs. And as Rebecca noted at the start, this is not just about, this is kind of working in tandem with the London living wage. This is about low to middle income workers and supporting them in getting closer or meeting or covering their essential costs, working hand in hand with the living wage. There are lots of big questions that come out of this, and there are lots of big questions around incomes and costs at the moment. Obviously, if there weren't a leadership election going on, and it wasn't so hot, that they would be the story, most of the time, and have been certainly over the first few months of this year. There are some big questions about the changed nature of work, and I think the extent to which work has actually been changed. Lots of talk, obviously, during lockdown about the ways in which people's patterns of work were changing, but often ignoring the fact that lots and lots of people didn't have that option and don't have that option. Many jobs can't be done from home. And therefore, to talk about people needing less because they're not commuting, or those sorts of questions are not relevant for lots and lots of workers. So work certainly hasn't changed in all sectors, and it's certainly, there are indications that it might not have changed as much as we would have thought it might. That was a bad sentence. That change hasn't been as long-lasting as we think it might have been. There's some big questions as well about geographical inequalities, or as it's also been called, levelling up. Who knows what will happen with levelling up under any new Prime Minister? And it's not a phrase that I necessarily particularly like, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that lots of households in London fall short of MIS. Levelling up should not be used as an excuse or a justification for not paying wages in London that enable people to have a decent standard of living. This is not about a race to the bottom. It's about ensuring, how are we levelling up? What are we levelling people up to? If one of the things we want to level people up to is a decent standard of living, then that's about ensuring that everyone is able to have that everywhere in the UK, not increasing wages in London in order to enable people to do that. As I said, I think the cost of living is going to have a significant increase on this, and I think it will be important to keep an eye on this. And as part of our ongoing minimum income standard work in London, I think it would certainly be possible to kind of, review and revise this calculation over the coming years. And I've talked for more than a quarter now, so I will leave that there.
Thank you, Matt. In my mind, it was going to be 20 minutes and it was 20 minutes. So there we go. Thank you. Can I pass over to Claire Harding, now Research Director at the Centre for London?
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Matt. And apologies to everybody. There is somebody outside who seems to have decided for today would be a really good day to renovate their garden furniture. And they have one of those violently noisy handheld sanders. So I will do my best, but if it becomes unbearable, we can maybe move on to the next speaker and then come back to me when they've stopped. They have stopped for the time being. So the first thing I wanted to say was thank you. That was a really interesting presentation.
Can I ask you to slow down your speech, please? I'm struggling to understand you. I'm hard of hearing.
Of course, thank you. So the first thing I wanted to say was thank you to Matt for that really interesting presentation. And I think there's so much in there that we could dig into. Oddly enough, in my old job, I was the person who did those childcare costs estimates for both London and rest of UK, and I know how hard it is. It's very different, I think, to doing the sorts of policy research that I usually do, where you say, this thing is really bad and we ought to spend more money on it, where frankly the precision doesn't matter greatly. This stuff, we really found, and I'm sure you did as well, Matt, that quite small tweaks to your sets of assumptions at the start can lead to quite dramatic changes that kind of multiply up and down. So yes, thank you for doing that. I definitely do not envy it. And thank you also, Matt, and Rebecca, in fact, for putting up with my many, many slightly pedantic questions throughout this process about trying to get to that most accurate figure possible. A few policy reflectors, probably more interesting to the people in the audience than me spending a lot of time talking about maths and exact weighting figures. But I think a few things that this raised to me, and Matt's very much touched on them. First, about geographical inequality within London. We saw in that presentation quite big gaps between the amount of additional costs in inner London and in outer London. That's no surprise. It costs more, of course, if you are commuting to central London. It costs more the further out you are. We know childcare costs tend to be higher in inner London than in outer, although it's not entirely straightforward, and there are some boroughs who have always been peculiar outliers to that pattern for years and years now. We've never quite got to the bottom of why some sort of how local markets operate. But also looking at the detail of Matt's work, there seem to be some interesting divisions coming up in those smaller cost elements as well, particularly to do with entertainment, and I think hairdressing was quite a big one. So I guess that raises a really big question about how much we expect people to move around within the city, how much we expect people to seek the cheaper places. Of course, we know they do that. And
I'd ask you to slow down, please. It came across that you said that care testing was one of the big costs, and the captions are struggling to understand what you're saying now, because I don't think you said care testing. Then you please slow down slightly. Thank you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I can't see the captions, so I can't see what's coming across. I said childcare costs are very different. So, and I guess that also leads us into a question about what our expectations should be between the nations and regions of the UK. Matt's, of course, alluded to levelling up, and it goes without saying we do a lot of work on levelling up at Centre for London. That we are by no means opposed to levelling up. What we must not see is levelling down, and I think this really shows that. But it also raises some really big policy questions for me about what we can reasonably expect people to do, how much we can reasonably expect people to move. I don't have the answers to those, but I think they're big and interesting questions to ask. And then related to that, how we deal with the fact that this is something that really only came up last week, data from Centre for Cities giving quite different inflation data for different cities within the UK. So on one level, and this seems rather unbelievable now, given that it's currently about 40 degrees and childcare bills don't bear thinking about, and neither do housing costs. On one level, London seems to be doing a little bit better at the moment, and that's largely, it seems, because public transport fares, they went up quite a lot. Last month, in March, they went up by between 4% and 6%. And at the time, we shouted a great deal about this and said 6.5%, which is 10 pence on the bus fare, was far too high. And now, of course, petrol prices have gone up much higher than that 6%. Likewise, fuel prices, houses in London tend to be smaller, better insulated. And of course, we have rather warmer weather, so we need much less gas and electricity to keep our homes warm on average than people living in the northeast. So I guess the question I'll leave us on is, how do we deal with the changing nature of geographical inequalities within the UK while continuing to make the case for London and what London needs, and while collaborating rather than sort of shouting across the divides, to make sure that, as far as we can, all the regions get what they need, and we're not sort of going in to a tit-for-tat debate. So no answers, but I think, as well as being some really practical information for employers who are looking to determine London weighting, this also raises some really interesting policy questions for people who are perhaps not doing that, but concerned more generally with policy in London. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Some really helpful reflections, both on the kind of data, but also the sort of context and questions that you raise. Julie, can I hand over to you, please?
You can. Thank you, Rebecca. I, like Claire, have a warning, but mine is to do with a fly. There's a fly in this room, and I'm going to work really hard to ignore it, but it will not leave. So thank you, Matt. I'll come on to why I'm thanking you specifically in a second. But as context, my organisation, ELBA, stands for the East London Business Alliance. So we can afford to be very London-centric in our opinion and position here. I appreciate where you're coming from, Claire, entirely, but luckily for us, constitutionally, we exist to reduce poverty and inequality in East London. Even though we've been working quite a lot in North and South and West for a few years, but that enables us to work with our membership. And that's why I guess we're unique. We're a membership charity. Our members are corporate supporters. There's around 100 corporate supporters who work with us each year, largely based in the Square Mile and the Canary Wharf area. So quite a lot of banks, law firms, insurance companies, and we work with them to reduce poverty and inequality, which basically means we design and manage and evaluate corporate community partnerships, but in 3 areas. The first one, the original one, is about supporting the voluntary sector to not just survive, but thrive through their skills and their expertise and targeted volunteering. The second area is around education, the obvious, raising aspirations, careers, destinations, social mobility. And then the third area is around economic equity and fairness. So working with our corporates to look at, on one level, their high skilled careers, access to progression within, particularly the intersection between that agenda and diversity, race, inequality, but also within their supply chains, and therefore looking at the working poor and what employers can do to bring about better standards and progression for the working poor. And that came from, and Rona, please, if I'm going too fast, just do the thing. That came from our first work in this area in 2004, basically was about access to jobs and unlocking jobs, catering, cleaning, security jobs, because it was actually the easiest thing to do first. So we would place thousands of people into work each year in those tall towers, and then go back to those candidates 2 years later and their wages were falling behind and they were having to move home and all sorts of things. So our work in this space has come really from working in this space and realizing that 2 Londons exist, right? And so we, of course, stand behind and support this agenda, this conversation. We find it incredibly useful. It's well timed, obviously, for all the reasons that we know about. The work, just very quickly, we do in this area is a lot to do with nudging and encouraging employers to do more. So from upskilling to financial capability to extending benefits standards. And that's where this work sits. Matt, the reason I want to thank you is because the report's like 14 pages. And as an organization that spends a lot of time trying to get employers to read reports, even the exec summary, the whole report, even the technical report is 16 or 17 pages. And so for an organization like ELBA that spends a lot of time nudging, encouraging, disseminating good practice, it helps that not only it's very easily absorbed, it's very intuitive. So when I read the report, and I say this because I appreciate the different types of communication styles you have to use with different audiences across employers, the thought processes that I went through on concluding whether or not this would work, stick, die, whatever, actually followed the chronological order, which at one point freaked me out, Matt, actually, I had to say. I was like, is this some data-based analysis that shows you how to, like literally the point it went into how it aligns with London Living Wage, and, you know, the fact that like it was very intuitive. And the reason that's useful is because from our perspective, from Elba's perspective, it's very easy for us to say, please continue this conversation. Let's dovetail with this conversation. Let's amplify this conversation. But actually the next thing we would want to do in support of it is socialize it with our employers. And as I said, in our phone book, we're talking about corporate employers who within their supply chain have, and sometimes within their immediate HR supply chain, have people in the earning brackets under 40, but certainly in their supply chain, caterers, cleaning, securities. And those critical questions, Matt, are really critical for them because one, you know, they are also incredibly aware of their role in the wider London economy, and a change made there will cascade potentially. So when London Living Wage as a concept was first introduced, employers in the city and square mile were some of the first to sort of introduce it to contracting terms, which, as we know, has led to a wider change. So we would 100% want to socialize it with our corporates and our companies and our members and their supply chains to get some different perspectives, because I think there'd be plenty. Instinctively, I think we'd hit the good old-fashioned data bump. And I do a lot of work in, when I say data, thinking about workforce demographics with regards to race and earning, and social class and earning, and gender and earning. And the data conversation will definitely delay progress. And I doubt that a number of our companies view their workforce with intel around household composition. That said, the minimum income standards framework, I know it's limited, but I definitely think that there is something about a starter for 10 conversation about the gap between where employers stand now in understanding their sort of pre-COVID, current and post, like long-term trend goals around workforce against household composition. I think there'll be some really interesting stuff in there to unpack, which made me think about us as an employer. Elba, as an employer, we are a small employer. We employ under 50 people. A good chunk of them would be within this space. And so it's quite, but we're a small employer, so it's quite easy for us to, with our annual data collection exercise, which considers if our employees' lifestyles have changed, or if their addresses have changed, or if their identities have changed, it's quite easy for us to introduce some sort of framework to enable this conversation to move forward. But again, I think the benefit of socializing this with wider and larger employers will be to sort of get lots of different perspectives, even on that first barrier of how they feel about household composition, what that means in London, and therefore how this connects with a wider cost of living response, crisis response. Luckily, it chimes with us and where we are, because obviously in the voluntary sector, the non-profit sector, pay and progression is why people leave us, mainly pay, because actually we have quite a flat structure. So we are having to look, we want to look at how, as an employer, we can use data sets like this, nudges like this to take us forward. But in summary and in closing, we are in complete support of this as a tool, as a methodology, as an approach to keep pushing this very important conversation forward, and stand ready to do what we can to bring employers to the table, to feed into that, to continue to build on its richness.
Julie, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure Matt might want to come back on some of those points in a second. What I'm going to do is hand over to Sam from the TUC for his comments, and then we'll hand back to Matt and then do some Q&A. So Sam.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and Rona and Rebecca, please try and keep me speaking slowly, because I'm notorious for speeding up even when I try and start, because I try and pack too much into a couple of minutes I've been given, and I've been adding lots of stuff based on what was just said there by my other respondents. I mean, I think the first thing to say is we would echo the welcoming of a report, not least because it's really useful evidence for just how much the cost of living crisis, emergency, is going to impact even more harshly on Londoners. And I take that point, but it was drafted kind of almost before we got into this kind of later stage. But nonetheless, the evidence about the additional cost of living in the capital, etc., are really important. And I'd also echo Julie's point about the clarity of a report and how useful it is to have quite a tight report which packs in the information, but which we can actually get other people to look at. With points on kind of the levelling up agenda have been made, but I think it is, and we don't know where the current crop of Tory leadership candidates are going to go on this, but I mean, I think the point is really important that when we're talking about levelling up at the moment, it seems that a lot of the government policy has actually been around taking resources away from an already limited pot and shifting them, rather than looking at the pot in total. And that obviously has a particularly negative impact on London, and it's absolutely critical, as has been said, that we keep the attention of policymakers on the incredible but what should still be really shocking facts about pay conditions and wider deprivation in London. I know no one on this meeting is going to need reminding, but the fact that we have the highest number of people in various forms of insecure work in the country, higher percentages than anywhere else, and higher gross numbers of people in 0 hours, short hours, bogus forms of self-employment, all of whom get massively negatively impacted in pay and other conditions. A lot of the colleagues, which Julia was just talking about, people in cleaning, security, etc. And that over 60% of households in poverty in London have at least one family member in work, and that we've got more people than ever who are, despite really good efforts to get the London living wage up, and that campaign kind of supported, we've actually got more people in real terms earning less from a London living wage in London than any time since it was actually created. Also, I'm quite sure that's true, but it's gone up. The number of people earning less from a London living wage is actually increasing. So from a TUC point of view, that's why kind of pay has been kind of very central part of our work. We've had the Britain Deserves Better campaign, big national demo last month, which got lots of publicity around pay as an issue, the cost of living emergency, and talking about why getting pay moving was crucial to that. We've actually got 5 headline calls on that, which is a pay rise for every worker and a real living wage for all. And we're going to be, I don't know if it's been announced yet, but we're moving our call for the minimum wage to go up to £15. Our call was £10, but £15 for the national minimum wage, but also an emergency budget, taxing energy profits, which already happened, raising universal credit, and obviously looking at that whole system, boosting union bargaining rights, because that's the most sustainable way of getting pay moving, and lots of work on equalities and trying to eliminate racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination in the workplace. So we've got that kind of wrapped up, but I said pay is absolutely central to that. Page 10 of the report was really good because it had a point which I get fed up about making, that the London living wage is a minimum floor, and we see lots of reports which kind of talk about getting more people onto the London living wage, which is great, but actually we need to see it moving up. And the point around pay, regional weighting on pay is kind of, that's another way of helping to move up pay generally. So I think really important. It's good to see that reflected. Thank you, Matt. And as oh, sorry.
Can you slow down, please?
Yep, sorry. I always do that. No matter how I try to keep it slow, and I speed up as I get going. Point was also made about.
That was the last thing I heard you say.
Oh, sorry, Rhoda, I lost connection there.
No, I said the last thing I heard you say was racism and sexism and other discrimination in the workplace. After that, it was a blur.
Fine. So the next point was that it's really good because the report talks about London living wage as a minimum floor, not as getting people onto the London living wage. But anyway, then we also need, as has been said, action to deal with the various costs which are soaring. So all been there and it's in the report, but housing, childcare, food and fuel going up everywhere, but in London, particular kind of impact of that. And when you talk to people in our region, across the region, that fear and anger is kind of incredibly real. So that point on area-based weighting being important to deal with those additional costs, and in the public sector in particular, to deal with the kind of fact that people are really struggling to recruit and retain people to keep our public services running in London. So when we're talking to kind of reps across all different sectors, but I was talking to colleagues in the Fire Brigade Union last week about how firefighters can't afford to live anywhere near their stations now. People are quitting, people are moving out of London, but the same goes for people in all sorts of other kind of public services in London. Massive shortages at the moment of drivers in refuse, etc. And people are often on quite low incomes, can't afford to live anywhere near where they work, and it's going to have an impact on everybody, not just those workers, but we won't have the public services that we need delivered. And I think also, I would just say, obviously, with my regional TUC hat on, although we are rightly talking about London here, also very important to remember that there are considerable other areas where you've got a much higher cost of living outside of London, particularly in our region. Housing costs in Oxford and Cambridge actually, on average, are more of an average wage than in nearly all of London, and other costs are high. So there's other regional kind of weighting that we need to look at, but specifically in London. And what sort of point we'd make, and this is as we go forward, it's really interesting listening to Julia around how we can persuade some of the kind of private sector employers that her organisation kind of works with and engages with. But in terms of kind of said public sector stuff as well, this is about political and economic decisions. So cost of living emergency hasn't come out of the blue. It's a result of a decade of standstill wages. We know working people have lost £20,000 on average in real earnings since the financial crisis up to now, because pay just hasn't been keeping pace with inflation even before we hit the current kind of massive increases in inflation. So workers on average earning £60 less in real terms than in 2008. And I said, we know that we've had this mushroom of insecure work. Latest figures up to 3.7 million. That's from 3 million a couple of years ago. Seen employers like P&O treating people like absolute, just disposable kind of waste effectively. And that has a huge cost for our economy, because that insecure work, we had a report out 2 weeks ago, so that's actually costing the economy £10 billion in lost taxes and other income. So I'll finish on this one, which is that we've seen kind of ministers having no hesitation in calling for pay restraints, but turning a blind eye to some of the kind of excesses in bonuses across different sectors. We've seen bonuses in the city and finance sector rising 6 times faster than pay, although the government is still continuing to cut funds for public services, and we'd need to get that moving again, so that some of these increases we're talking about in weighting could actually be met, because without more money going into the system, we know that local authorities, health service, etc., just won't be able to lift those wages up. So we need to get movement on London weighting in the public sector. We also need to get the private sector to look at kind of what's happening across pay across the whole piece, and why they're having particular retention and recruitment issues in the capital, and how this would help. So it's about political and economic decisions, and we have to work together to kind of win some of those arguments, make the business case, but also make the services case as well.
Sam, thank you. Matt, shall I hand back to you? Are there sort of particular points that you want to come back on? And then just keeping an eye on the time, we were planning to finish at 11. I think maybe if anybody else has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or pop your hand up, and we'll sort of see how many we have and try to make best use of the 11 minutes that we have left. So Matt, let me hand over to you. I'll
be very fast in responding. It's nice to hear that the report is a good length. Genuinely, we do this work because we want it to be useful, and that includes communicating it in useful ways. And we rarely get any feedback from the people who use it. So thank you. It's made my Monday morning. It's a good start to the week anyway. I think there's lots of important questions around the kind of moral questions about which often get left out of this, and I don't want to go down a big rabbit hole, but about pay, about inequality, about the sorts of things that we as a society think are reasonable expectations. I thought Claire's point about what it's reasonable to expect in terms of mobility across London or traveling to work, distances to work. What are reasonable expectations when we're thinking and talking about that? What are reasonable expectations when it comes to, you know, leveling up, which is vague, and a very important point about shifting resources not being a solution, you know, growing the pot rather than shifting the pot. I think there's lots and lots of questions that this, and agendas and debates that this feeds into, and I think I'd very much like to see this as the start of a useful conversation rather than the end of a useful conversation, because I think, you know, part of what we were trying to do is to yes, revise the way in which we come up with this, but also, you know, make the point that this is an important thing to consider, particularly in light of, you know, everyone clapping all of those hardworking public sector workers, but, you know, the clapping doesn't get you, doesn't heat your home. I'll stop there. That was vague and rambling, wasn't it? Sorry.
Thanks, Matt. Rona, I can see you have your hand up. Do you have a question?